Rome was chaos on every imaginable level. Living in it was chaotic, dealing with it even more so, and just trying to talk about it. Messy business. And honestly, that's part of the charm. There isn't just one definitive version of Rome's history. Every era, every province, every social group, and every outsider had their own lens through which they saw Rome. What I want to do here is paint a full picture of Rome, not just a tale of wars or a study of literature, politics, or architecture, though I'd love to get into that, and definitely not a rundown of imperial scandals. No, this is the story of an idea, Rome as a Mediterranean civilization state. This is about the shared vision that united generations under the name Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and People of Rome. Those iconic letters SPQR weren't just a catchy slogan. They were a collective oath, a promise that lived on for centuries through waves of transformation. That kind of enduring identity gives Rome a certain magic. It's unmatched, and it's worth understanding not only what Rome became, but the long, steady, intentional work behind its rise and preservation. The early history especially is a slow burn generations investing in something whose final form they would never live to see. I think that's pretty incredible. So, as we trace this story from the very beginning and journey through 2,000 years of glory, triumph, and more than a few spectacular disasters, let's dive in. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was built deliberately. What we know as Roman civilization wasn't an accident. It was shaped by countless people over the centuries, men and women, young and old, powerful and powerless, all working together to create something extraordinary. We can still admire what they built across 3 continents, but the real foundation isn't stone or brick, it's cultural. What sustained this vast and evolving identity called Rome? That question brings us to the earliest roots of their story. Unfortunately, those early records are mostly lost. In 390 BC, the city was burned by a tribe of Gauls, wiping out the earliest Roman chronicles. So what we have instead is legend, a mix of myth and calculated propaganda. But that's not entirely a problem. Later, Romans were just as puzzled about their origins, and they were determined to solve that mystery. Lacking solid facts, they invented a narrative, crafted it even. They blended half-remembered myths and hints of the Rome they already knew to build a story that explained who they were. Over centuries, these folk tales were polished by generations of storytellers until they solidified around the start of the first millennium. This creation myth is our best insight into what Romans valued, their ambitions, their identity. So let's unravel this origin tale to uncover the cultural roots of Rome. The Romans claimed their lineage began around the 1102 BC. Troy had just fallen, and a prince named Aeneas escaped the destruction. After various adventures, he landed in Italy and became king of Latium. But it wasn't time for Rome just yet. His descendants ruled in Alba Longa, south of the Tiber River, for about 400 years. Eventually, King Numitor was overthrown by his brother Amulius. To cut off Numitor's bloodline, Amulius made his niece, Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin. This tactic rarely worked in stories involving gods, and sure enough, Mars, the god of war, fathered twins with her Romulus and Remus. Amulius ordered the twins to be drowned in the Tiber, but they were saved and nursed by a she-wolf before being raised by shepherds. Their origin: 1 dad, 2 moms, 1 god, and a wolf. When they came of age, they overthrew Amulius and founded a new city near the Tiber. But in the process of laying out the walls, the brothers quarreled. Romulus killed Remus, history's first of many Roman civil conflicts. That's why we call it Rome, not Reme. Romulus, now sole ruler, populated the city by welcoming exiles and criminals. To ensure future generations, he orchestrated the mass abduction of Sabine women. If Rhea Silvia got divine help, Rome would get its heirs by force. Romulus didn't stop at population. He shaped core Roman institutions, tribes, class divisions, marriage laws, patronage, even the Senate, all seemed to burst into life under him. After Romulus, 6 more kings ruled. The last 3 came from the Etruscan Tarquin family. The final one, Tarquinius Superbus, lived up to the Superbus name, arrogant and cruel. His tyranny provoked Rome's first political upheaval. The people rose up and expelled him, ending the monarchy and launching the Roman Republic in 509 BC. From there, Rome's destiny began unfolding, first dominating the Italian peninsula with civic might and military strength, then reaching across the Mediterranean. It's a clean, noble tale, too clean. So now let's dig into it and start tearing it apart. Rome's official founding year, 753 BC, is more of a calculated estimate than a hard fact. It was suggested during the 1st century BC, likely to align Rome's birth with the timing of the earliest Olympic Games in Greece. As for the rest of the myth, it reads like fan fiction, crafted to retrofit legendary beginnings into a coherent timeline. Take Aeneas, the supposed Trojan survivor whose journey to Italy echoes Odysseus a little too closely. His story first appears not in Roman tales, but in Greek accounts from the time of the Republic, and he's set centuries before the founding of Rome, which left a sizable gap in the timeline. This gap, nearly 400 years between Aeneas and Romulus, felt too empty. So a historian named Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BC, came up with a solution: the Alban kings. He filled in the blank space with a line of monarchs ruling Alba Longa, Rome's supposed mother city. These kings had almost no defining traits beyond their names, and some of those names matched local landmarks suspiciously well. It's almost like Dionysius glanced around the landscape and said, "This hill must have been ruled by King Hyllus. Trust me." Only when we get to the story of Romulus and Remus do these characters start doing anything. That tale is deeply mythological, divine parentage, miraculous survival wolves as foster moms, and even Livy, Rome's famous historian, expresses skepticism about some of its details. But what might be even harder to believe than divine conception or wolf nursing is the idea that Rome had exactly 7 kings over a span of 244 years. That would require each king to have ruled for an average of 35 years, which is a level of consistency seen in only 2 emperors throughout all of Roman history. That's where our realism alarm starts blaring. Every element of this story seems reverse-engineered to bridge major milestones: the known start of the Republic in 509 BC, the city's fuzzy founding in the 702nd, and the legendary Bronze Age origins of Aeneas. Everything in between is narrative duct-tape myths created to patch holes and make it all fit. Even back then, Romans puzzled over how to reconcile Aeneas and Romulus in the same tradition. It wasn't until the age of Augustus that they officially decided Aeneas started the Roman dynasty and Romulus built the city. Compare that to Athens, where they were totally fine with having multiple founding figures, including the shady Theseus. But Rome wanted one clean, linear story. So they molded it. They took this naturally evolving tradition of tales and forced it to obey the rules of historical continuity. They didn't need facts, just a story that made internal sense. Of course, the Alban kings were fabricated to plug the gap. Only Aeneas and Romulus truly mattered. The rest, window dressing. Rome's creation story wasn't for the historians. It was for the Romans. And in the absence of written records from before the 390 BC sack, this was the closest thing they had to a founding document. As a historical record, it leaves us wanting, But as a cultural artifact, it's priceless. It shows us exactly what the Romans believed about themselves and how they wanted to be seen. Their heroes were divine offspring of Venus and Mars. Their bloodlines were as old as any in Greece. They came from all corners of the known world. Civil conflict was in their DNA. They absolutely had a weird obsession with wolves. And above all, they overthrew tyrants. That's Rome in a nutshell. The rest, Livy's filler episodes. Yet for a tale rooted in antiquity, some of Romulus's deeds seem shockingly forward-looking. Take, for instance, his first big move as king, welcoming society's outcasts, criminals, exiles, misfits, as the city's first citizens. On the surface, that might sound a little unheroic, but it hints at one of Rome's most defining traits: radical openness. Rome, for all its pride and superiority, was a cultural sponge. It adopted good ideas wherever it found them. Any outsider could become Roman so long as they embraced Roman customs and spoke the language. Romans saw themselves as outsiders from the very start, be they Trojan refugees or Italian exiles. And that openness extended even to freed slaves who could earn Roman citizenship, a stark contrast to the exclusivity of Greek society. So what sounds like a haphazard foundation myth actually encodes a core Roman value. Anyone, regardless of origin, could become Roman. And that mindset is what allowed Rome to grow into a civilization spanning the Mediterranean. But alongside that promise came a haunting shadow. Rome's original sin, fratricide. Romulus killed his own brother at the city's founding. It wasn't just a crime, it was a curse. Civil war would become a bloody theme the Romans repeated for 2,000 years. The stories of Rome's origin found their final form centuries later, immortalized in Livy's History of Rome and Virgil's Aeneid. Unless archaeology someday gives us more insight into those earliest settlements on the Tiber's hills, this is the best we've got. And while the historical clarity sharpens as Rome moves from monarchy to republic, the meaning of its founding myth only becomes more relevant. The myth doesn't tell us who the first Romans were. It doesn't confirm if they came from Troy or had kings at all, but it tells us volumes about who the Romans believed they were and who they aspired to be. Cunning, ambitious, unrelenting. Crafty bastards, in short. And over the next 2,000 years, they would more than live up to that name. Rome's earliest years after the monarchy weren't driven by grand plans of conquest. They were shaped instead by necessity, by the constant need to secure borders and fend off threats. When the Etruscans were expelled, and the Gauls sacked the city in 390 BC, the Romans realized survival meant expansion. It was less a strategy of domination and more a policy of expanding defense. The logic was simple: eliminate nearby dangers, fortify territory, and repeat. In practice, this meant Rome would always find one more enemy to fight, one more frontier to push. This pattern explains how Rome, step by step, carved its way through Etruria, Samnium, Magna Graecia, Carthage, Macedonia, Gaul, Syria, Egypt, Germania, and Parthia. Each war seemed defensive at first, but defense always pushed the borders outward, and once expanded, the new edges needed defending too. Rome didn't have a master plan for ruling the Mediterranean. It had priorities that each generation renewed, turning survival into empire. In the early Republic, Rome's neighbors provided plenty of conflict. The Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the south, and eventually the Greek colonies in Magna Graecia all clashed with the rising city. This era was marked by spear against spear, city against city, and a lot of messy back and forth. But as Rome fought, it also built. The city grew walls, laid down streets, dug sewers, and erected temples of stone. Its institutions took shape too heavily influenced by Greek models. The religion mirrored the Greek pantheon, and the government resembled the polis system. By the time the last Tarquin king was ousted, much of the republic's framework was already in place. Rome didn't invent everything from scratch, it reorganized. Instead of a king, 2 annually elected consuls led the state. Praetors oversaw justice, quaestors managed finances. Aediles kept the city fed, entertained, and functioning. And above them, the Senate gave policy opinions that carried immense weight, even if not technically law. In reality, the Senate steered the ship of state. But the system was tilted. Almost all offices were monopolized by the patrician elite. The vast majority of citizens, the plebeians, were excluded from power. They fought back, not with weapons, but with strikes. Refusing to serve in the army, they camped outside the city until demands were met. Slowly, painfully, across 2 centuries, they forced reforms: the right to marry patricians, to elect their own tribunes, to hold magistracies, even to reach the consulship. By 287 BC, plebeians and patricians were legally equal, though social divides lingered. Rome's republic combined monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in one system. This mixed constitution, praised by the historian Polybius, gave Rome flexibility and resilience. Institutions acted like a backbone strong enough to hold a civilization together for centuries. But while politics evolved slowly, Rome's military adventures steadily grew. Expansion was cautious. The Romans moved methodically, unlike the reckless rush of Alexander's empire to the east. By the 4th century, Rome had extended control only as far as the Bay of Naples. It seemed slow, but patience worked. Rome's guiding principle of expanding defense justified every step. They never claimed aggression. Rome would only fight if provoked, or if they suspected they might be provoked. In that case, a preemptive strike was framed as self-defense. This legalistic piety let Rome conquer the world, while insisting it fought only righteous wars. By 280 BC, Rome had subdued the Samnites and turned to Magna Graecia. The Greek cities there called for help from Pyrrhus of Epirus, a skilled Hellenistic king. Pyrrhus beat the Romans in 2 battles, but his victories cost so many lives that they became infamous as Pyrrhic victories. Winning wasn't worth the price. After further struggles, Pyrrhus retreated, and Rome absorbed southern Italy. Rome's treatment of conquered peoples was distinctive. Rather than destroy and rebuild, they often preserved local systems and extended partial privileges. This pragmatism made incorporation smoother, though it wasn't always gentle. And soon this adaptability would be tested in wars far larger than anything Italy had seen: the Punic Wars against Carthage. The first clash was almost accidental. Both Rome and Carthage were pulled into a dispute in Sicily involving pirates and local allies. The rivalry escalated into a war that lasted 23 years. Carthage dominated the seas, but Rome had no fleet. So Rome built one fast. They reverse-engineered captured Carthaginian ships, creating a navy almost from scratch. Early efforts floundered, but Rome adapted quickly. At battles like Cape Ecnomus, among the largest naval clashes in history, Rome proved its new power. By war's end, Rome had taken Sicily, imposed heavy reparations on Carthage, and snatched Corsica and Sardinia as well. Carthage, bitter and weakened, turned to Spain to recover. Under Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal, they built a new base of power, mining silver and plotting revenge. Their eyes remained fixed on Rome. In 219 BC, Hannibal sacked the Roman ally Saguntum. Rome declared war. Hannibal responded with one of history's boldest moves, marching an army, complete with 37 elephants, over the Alps into Italy. Most elephants didn't survive the journey. but those that did terrified the Romans. To soldiers who had never seen such beasts, they looked like monsters, giant tusked nightmares with serpentine trunks. For the next 16 years, Hannibal roamed Italy. He ambushed and shattered Roman armies, burned farms and terrorized the countryside. Rome, stunned but unbroken, shadowed him, harassing without giving him the chance to strike at the city itself. Hannibal's greatest triumph came at Cannae in 216 BC, where his army surrounded and annihilated a force nearly twice its size. Tens of thousands of Romans died in a single day, the worst defeat in their history. Any other state would have surrendered. Rome simply raised new legions and vowed to fight again. That stubborn resilience became Rome's hallmark. They bled, but they never broke. Hannibal's campaign in Italy dragged on year after year. He stayed behind enemy lines for more than a decade and a half, with little hope of steady reinforcements. His army fed itself by plundering the countryside, torching farms, and trying to break Roman resolve. Yet the city held. Rome refused to surrender. Instead, they shadowed him, harassed him, and endured his destruction, waiting for the moment to strike back. The turning point came not in Italy, but in Spain. There, a young commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio took up what most considered a doomed mission, wresting Spain from Carthaginian control. Against all odds, he succeeded. Over 5 years, Scipio dismantled Carthage's Spanish holdings, piece by piece cutting off the wealth that fueled Hannibal's war. Then he proposed something audacious: carry the fight directly into North Africa. The Senate thought he was mad. They refused to fund him, so Scipio raised troops in Italy and Sicily, built his own army, and sailed across the sea. His brilliance lay not in raw daring, but in adaptability. Where Hannibal excelled at shock and maneuver, Scipio mastered the Roman art of learning from mistakes. He studied Hannibal's tactics at Cannae, understood what had gone wrong, and set out to counter it. By forging alliances in Numidia, he even stole away Carthage's crucial cavalry advantage. When Scipio's forces closed in on Carthage, Hannibal was recalled from Italy. The stage was set for a final, decisive clash. On the eve of the battle, the two men supposedly met face to face. The account preserved in Livy's History of Rome reads almost like theatre. They expressed mutual respect. Hannibal spoke of fortune, of the fleeting nature of power, and asked for peace. Scipio listened, then refused. He admired his opponent, but Rome's survival demanded Carthage's defeat. The next day at Zama, the armies met. Numidian cavalry on Scipio's side routed Carthage's horsemen. The infantry lines clashed bitterly, evenly matched for a time, but when the Roman cavalry swept back onto the battlefield, the trap closed. Carthage broke. Hannibal, undefeated for so long, was at last overcome. The Second Punic War was finished. Rome's victory was staggering. Hannibal had been their nightmare, his name a terror whispered for decades. Yet Rome had endured him, adapted, and emerged stronger. Half a century later, they would return for the Third Punic War and obliterate Carthage, entirely burning the city, enslaving the survivors, and in later retellings, salting the earth so nothing would grow again. Whether or not that last detail was true, the symbolism was clear. Rome did not merely win. It erased its rival from history. From that moment, Carthage was no more. The Western Mediterranean belonged to Rome. With Spain and North Africa secured, Roman ambition turned east. The old Hellenistic kingdoms, fragments of Alexander's empire, were weakened, divided, and ripe for conquest. Macedonia had sided with Carthage, giving Rome its excuse. Wars followed, and one by one Greek and Eastern powers fell before Roman spears. Rome didn't immediately annex everything. At first they preferred to cripple enemies, humble them, and leave them weak but intact. But gradually, protection became control. The provinces piled up. Rome was no longer just a republic. It was an empire in all but name. By the mid-2nd century BC, Rome had grown accustomed to exporting violence abroad, but the habits of war had consequences at home. Soldiers returned with loot slaves and wealth beyond imagining. Aristocrats seized vast tracts of land, turning farms into estates. The poor, displaced and restless, crowded into the city. The gap between rich and poor widened, and the Roman way of solving disputes through force was creeping into politics itself. In 146 BC, the same year Carthage was destroyed, Rome also crushed Corinth, one of Greece's greatest cities. The city was looted, its people killed, or enslaved, its treasures carried back to Rome. For mapmakers, it was a triumphant year, painting Greece and North Africa red. For Rome's new subjects, it was devastation. Violence had become part of Rome's statecraft, a tool as much for managing provinces as for winning wars. That violence would soon turn inward. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean, but it had not conquered itself. In the aftermath of Rome's sweeping conquests, pressure inside the Republic began to build. Wealth and power clustered around a small elite, while ordinary citizens were pushed aside. The patron-client system, where wealthy nobles supported dependents in exchange for loyalty, began to scale into something darker: mass patronage, where political power could be bought in bulk. Rome's victories had made it rich, but inequality poisoned its politics. Into this volatile setting stepped the Gracchi brothers. They were born plebeians, but connected to Rome's most illustrious families. Their mother was the daughter of Scipio Africanus himself. Tiberius Gracchus the elder saw firsthand the plight of dispossessed citizens. Vast estates had devoured public lands, leaving countless Romans without farms or livelihoods. In 133 BC, as tribune of the plebs, Tiberius pushed for reform. His law would limit how much public land a person could hold and redistribute the excess to the poor. The idea was not new. A similar law had existed since 367 BC, though it was long ignored. Enforcement had lapsed, and the aristocracy grew fat on land taken during wars. Now Tiberius aimed to revive it, threatening the fortunes of senators who had grown wealthy off this imbalance. And unlike earlier attempts, he tied administration of the reform directly to himself and his family, giving him immense control. The Senate resisted. One of his fellow tribunes even vetoed the proposal. Outraged, Tiberius had him deposed, something never done before, and forced the measure through. Even supporters found this unnerving. What started as an act of justice looked dangerously like a grab for power. Worse still, Tiberius sought re-election for a second consecutive term as tribune, breaking tradition. His opponents saw it as proof that he aimed to make himself king in all but name. On the day of the vote, senators stormed the assembly. With no weapons at hand, they grabbed stools, clubs, even chairs, and beat Tiberius and hundreds of his followers to death. It was the first time Roman politics turned to organized murder, and the line once crossed could never be restored. But history repeated. Gaius Gracchus, younger and more ambitious, took office in 123 BC. His reforms went further, fixing grain prices to help the poor, restructuring provincial taxes, reducing corruption in courts, and limiting senatorial abuse of power. He courted the equestrian class, Rome's wealthy non-senatorial elite, giving them authority in exchange for support. His vision was sweeping, his popularity unmatched, and his reforms dug deep into every corner of governance. Yet Gaius also inherited his brother's enemies. When he proposed extending citizenship to Rome's Italian allies, the backlash was fierce. Romans jealously guarded their privileges, and his popularity collapsed. In the unrest that followed, violence broke out. The Senate invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree branding Gaius and his supporters enemies of the state. Armed forces stormed his stronghold on the Aventine Hill. Gaius likely fell on his own sword, but thousands of his allies were slaughtered. The deaths of the Gracchi set a new precedent. Politics in Rome was now a battleground where assassination and massacre were accepted tools. Their reforms, though partly undone, reshaped the Republic. The plebeians had tasted power, the equestrians gained influence, and the Senate had blood on its hands. Violence had been invited into the heart of Roman politics, and it would never leave. In the decades that followed, Rome lurched from one crisis to another. Slave revolts erupted. The social war broke out when Rome's Italian allies, long denied citizenship, rose against their overlords. Even after victory, Rome had to extend full citizenship to all Italians. And then came civil wars between rival factions, between generals, between visions of Rome's future. The first great clash came between Marius, the populist champion, and Sulla, the aristocratic general. Their rivalry tore Rome apart. Sulla did the unthinkable, marched his army into Rome itself twice, declaring himself dictator and unleashing purges on his enemies. Thousands were killed. What had begun with clubs in the Forum under Tiberius Gracchus now escalated to armies in the streets. By the 1st century BC, Rome was still expanding outward into Spain, North Africa, Greece, and beyond, but inwardly it was imploding. The republic that had once prided itself on order and shared governance was now devouring itself with factional bloodshed. The old balance between Senate magistrates and assemblies was broken. Rome had become its own worst enemy. Out of the chaos of civil strife, Rome discovered a new kind of power, generals whose loyalty came not from the Senate, but from their armies. When Marius reformed military recruitment, he opened the legions to the poor, who had no property and no stake in politics. These men fought not for the Republic, but for the commanders who promised them pay, loot, and land when the wars were done. Armies became personal, and generals became political forces in their own right. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was the first to march on Rome, but he would not be the last. His dictatorship showed the fragility of the Republic's institutions. He killed opponents through proscriptions lists of names posted in public squares, authorizing anyone to hunt them down for reward. Families were stripped of wealth, entire lineages erased. He believed this terror would restore the Senate's authority and stabilize the state. Instead, it left scars and set a brutal precedent violence could decide politics. After Sulla's death, ambitious men stepped into the power vacuum. Pompey rose with dazzling victories in the east, defeating pirates, crushing Mithridates, and securing Rome's hold over Syria and Judea. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, made his mark by brutally ending the slave revolt led by Spartacus. Their wealth and prestige overshadowed the Senate itself. At the same time, a young Julius Caesar was making his climb, shrewd, charming, and utterly relentless. The three formed an uneasy alliance in 60 BC, remembered as the First Triumvirate. It was not an official office, but a pact Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar would share power, sideline the Senate, and pursue their interests together. Pompey got land for his veterans. Crassus secured lucrative tax contracts for his allies. Caesar was elected consul and granted command in Gaul. Together they bent the Republic to their will. Caesar's Gallic campaigns transformed him. Over nearly a decade he subdued tribes, crossed rivers and mountains, and even invaded Britain. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written in his own hand, were as much propaganda as history. They portrayed him as both heroic conqueror and loyal servant of Rome, carefully shaping his image for the people back home. While Rome debated, Caesar was amassing wealth, prestige, and above all the loyalty of hardened legions. The alliance began to fracture. Crassus died in a disastrous battle against the Parthians at Carrhae. Pompey, left in Rome, grew closer to the Senate and distanced himself from Caesar. Suspicion turned to rivalry. The Senate, fearing Caesar's power, demanded he disband his army and return as a private citizen. For Caesar, this meant political ruin and likely prosecution. He chose defiance. In 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with his legion, a deliberate act of war against the Republic. According to legend, he declared, "The die is cast." Civil war erupted. Pompey fled to Greece, rallying senators and allies, but Caesar's momentum was unstoppable. He marched swiftly through Italy, defeated Pompey's forces in Spain, then crossed into Greece. At Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar crushed Pompey's army. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge, only to be murdered by courtiers eager to win Caesar's favor. Instead of triumph, the assassination horrified Caesar, who wept at the sight of his rival's severed head. Caesar lingered in Egypt, entangled in local politics, and in Cleopatra herself. Their alliance, personal and political, produced a son, and further cemented his influence. Yet Caesar still had wars to fight in Asia, Africa, and Spain before he could finally claim victory in the civil wars. By 45 BC, he stood unrivaled master of Rome. The Republic was dead in all but name. Caesar held the offices of consul, dictator, and pontifex maximus. He controlled the armies, the treasury, and the assemblies. But he moved carefully, presenting himself not as a king Romans hated kings, but as the defender of order. He pardoned enemies, reformed debts, reorganized the calendar, and planned new colonies. Still, power concentrated in one man unsettled many. Whispers of monarchy began to spread. On the Ides of the 4th of March, 4 BC senators struck. Led by Brutus and Cassius, men who had once called Caesar a friend, they stabbed him beneath the statue of Pompey. 23 wounds ended his life. They believed they were saving the Republic. Instead, they unleashed another storm. Rome once again spiraled into chaos. The Republic was too fractured to restore. Caesar's death had not revived it, it had killed it. Caesar's assassination was meant to preserve liberty, but it achieved the opposite. The conspirators had no plan beyond the murder. They expected the Republic to revive itself once Caesar was gone, as if politics could heal by default. Instead, Rome split into factions, each rallying behind different champions, and the cycle of civil war began again. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, seized the moment. He took control of Caesar's papers, funds, and even his funeral. In a fiery oration before the people, he displayed Caesar's blood-stained cloak and stirred the crowd to fury. The assassins who had imagined themselves liberators fled the city in fear. Antony stood as Rome's new power broker. But Caesar had named another heir, his grandnephew Octavian, a youth of only 19. Few took him seriously at first. He was frail, untested, and surrounded by veterans who had marched with Caesar himself. Yet Octavian possessed something rare: patience, cunning, and a ruthless instinct for survival. Slowly he gathered support, winning over legions by paying them from his inheritance. The Senate, hoping to use him against Antony, gave him legitimacy. What they created was not a pawn but a rival. Conflict flared. Octavian and Antony briefly clashed, then made peace when the greater threat emerged. Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, had raised armies in the east. In 43 BC, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, a legally recognized dictatorship with sweeping powers. To fund their campaigns, they unleashed proscriptions worse than Sulla's. Senators, equestrians, and wealthy citizens were hunted down, their property seized. Even Cicero, the great orator who opposed Antony, fell victim. His hands and tongue were nailed to the rostra in the Forum, a grim warning to all. At Philippi in 42 BC, the triumvirs confronted Brutus and Cassius. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Cassius, misled by false reports, took his own life. Brutus fought on, but was ultimately defeated, choosing suicide over capture. The cause of the Republic died with them. Rome belonged to the triumvirs. But unity never lasts long in Roman politics. Lepidus was sidelined, leaving Antony and Octavian to divide the empire. Antony took the wealthy east, while Octavian claimed the west. Their arrangement was uneasy at best. Antony, ambitious and restless, bound himself to Cleopatra in Egypt, forging both a romance and an alliance. To Octavian this was treasonous, a Roman leader surrendering himself to a foreign queen. The propaganda wrote itself. Octavian worked tirelessly to portray Antony as a traitor, a man bewitched by Cleopatra, willing to abandon Rome for luxury and lust. In contrast, Octavian cast himself as the defender of traditional Roman values. The Senate, swayed by this narrative, granted him extraordinary powers. War became inevitable. In 31 BC, the rival forces met at Actium, a naval showdown off the coast of Greece. Octavian's admiral Agrippa outmaneuvered Antony's fleet. Cleopatra fled the battle, and Antony followed, leaving his men behind. Their cause collapsed. The next year, with Octavian closing in both Antony and Cleopatra, chose suicide rather than capture. Egypt, the last of the Hellenistic kingdoms, fell to Rome. Its immense wealth now flowed into Octavian's hand. Octavian returned to Rome not just as a victor, but as something new. He had ended a century of civil war. He had no rival left. The Senate, exhausted and powerless, showered him with honors. In 27 BC, they gave him a new title, Augustus. It meant the revered one. The Republic still existed in name, but in practice, Augustus was Rome. He held tribunician power, proconsular authority, control of the legions, and the loyalty of the people. He called himself princeps first among equals, but everyone knew the truth. The Republic was gone. The empire had begun. Augustus reshaped Rome with a steady hand. He understood that brute force alone would not hold power. He needed legitimacy. Outwardly, he preserved the forms of the Republic. The Senate still met. Magistrates were still elected, and assemblies still gathered. But, beneath the surface, everything had changed. Augustus controlled the provinces with the largest armies. He appointed governors, and he commanded absolute loyalty from soldiers who swore oaths directly to him, not to the state. He wrapped his authority in careful language. He called himself princeps, the first citizen. He styled his rule as the principate, not a monarchy. Kingship was hated in Rome, but Augustus gave the people stability, security, and prosperity, things they had long craved after decades of bloodshed. He knew appearances mattered, so he shared power in name while keeping it in practice. His reforms were sweeping. He reorganized the army into a professional force with fixed terms of service and pensions, ensuring loyalty to the emperor. He stationed legions on the frontiers, where they defended the empire rather than meddle in politics. He created the Praetorian Guard to serve as his personal protectors in Rome itself, though in time they would become dangerous kingmakers. He overhauled taxation, established permanent civil services, and even built a fire brigade and police force, basic necessities the Republic had never managed. Culturally, Augustus positioned himself as Rome's moral guardian. He passed laws encouraging marriage and childbearing, while punishing adultery. He presented himself as a restorer of tradition, reviving old religious rites and restoring temples. He poured wealth into monumental architecture, the Arapacis, the Forum of Augustus, and countless marble projects that transformed the city's skyline. As he boasted, He found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The arts flourished under his patronage. Poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid defined the cultural identity of the new empire. Virgil's Aeneid in particular gave Rome a national epic tracing Augustus's lineage back to Aeneas and the gods themselves. Through literature, Augustus cast his reign as the fulfillment of destiny, a golden age ordained by fate. Militarily, Augustus expanded the empire's reach. He secured Egypt Rome's breadbasket. He pushed into Spain, Gaul, and the Balkans. He extended control into the Middle East and along the Danube. His generals advanced into Germania as well, until disaster struck in 9 AD. At the Teutoburg forest, 3 Roman legions were ambushed and annihilated by Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The loss stunned Rome. Augustus was said to have torn his clothes and cried, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." From that moment, the Rhine became Rome's effective frontier in the north. Despite the setback, Augustus's reign delivered peace, the famous Pax Romana. For nearly 2 centuries after him, the empire enjoyed relative stability, its provinces connected by roads, aqueducts, and trade routes that spread goods, ideas, and cultures across vast distances. It was an age of integration, where a subject in Gaul, Syria, or Egypt could feel part of something greater Rome. When Augustus died in 14 AD, he had ruled for over 40 years. On his deathbed, he reportedly asked those around him whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life. The answer was obvious. He had transformed Rome forever. Though he never wore a crown, he had founded an imperial system that would outlast him for centuries. The succession passed to his stepson Tiberius. Augustus had carefully arranged for stability, adopting heirs and training them for rule. But the problem of succession would haunt the empire. Rome had no clear law of inheritance for supreme power, and every emperor after Augustus would face the same question: who comes next? Tiberius inherited Augustus's empire, but not his charisma. Reserved, cautious, and often bitter, he ruled effectively, yet inspired little affection. He strengthened Rome's finances, kept the borders secure, and avoided reckless wars, but his reign grew increasingly sour. Suspicious of conspiracies, he leaned heavily on treason trials, where accusations of disloyalty could destroy senators overnight. By the end, he withdrew from Rome altogether, living on the island of Capri, leaving much of the administration in the hands of ruthless advisors like Sejanus. To the people, he seemed aloof, even sinister, and when he died in 37 AD, Rome celebrated his passing more than his accomplishments. His successor, Caligula, began with promise. Grandson of Germanicus, beloved by the army, he was welcomed with joy. At first, he charmed the city with generosity, games, and public works. But soon his reign spiraled into infamy. Ancient accounts describe him as erratic, cruel, and possibly unhinged. He squandered wealth on extravagant spectacles, insulted senators, and demanded divine honors. Tales of depravity abound. Whether exaggerated or true, they painted him as a mad tyrant. After only 4 years, his own guards turned on him, stabbing him to death in the palace. Rome had its first emperor assassinated, proving that even supreme rulers could fall to the blade. The Praetorian Guard who had killed Caligula now elevated his uncle Claudius. Awkward, bookish, and underestimated Claudius surprised everyone. He proved capable reforming the administration, expanding citizenship, and overseeing major public works like aqueducts. Militarily, he brought Britain into the empire, a feat Augustus himself had avoided. Yet his personal life became his undoing. Manipulated by wives and courtiers, Claudius made poor choices in succession. His last wife, Agrippina, ensured her son Nero was positioned to rule. Soon after, Claudius was poisoned, likely at her hand. Nero began as a young, cultured prince, tutored by the philosopher Seneca, but power warped him. Obsessed with the arts, he fancied himself a poet, actor, and musician, scandalizing Rome by performing publicly. Meanwhile, his governance grew tyrannical. He executed rivals, including his own mother Agrippina. In 64 AD, a great fire consumed much of Rome. Nero's response, seizing land for his lavish Golden House palace, fueled rumors that he had started the blaze. To deflect blame, he accused Christians, subjecting them to brutal persecutions. His later years were marked by paranoia, extravagance, and bloody purges. Rebellions erupted in Gaul and Judea, and even the Praetorian Guard turned against him. Declared a public enemy, Nero fled and took his own life in 68 AD, ending the Julio-Claudian line. What followed was chaos, the year of the four emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian rose in rapid succession, each backed by legions marching on Rome. Civil war raged until Vespasian prevailed, founding the Flavian dynasty. Practical and competent, he restored order, replenished finances, and launched grand building projects. His most famous legacy was the Flavian amphitheatre, better known as the Colosseum. His son Titus inaugurated it, with games lasting 100 days, even as disasters marked his short reign, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, and a massive fire in Rome. He was succeeded by his brother Domitian, a harsh autocrat who centralized power and alienated the Senate. Though efficient as a ruler, his cruelty made him deeply unpopular, and in 96 AD, he too was assassinated. From this turbulence emerged the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, remembered as Rome's golden age. Beginning with Nerva and continuing through Trajan Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, the empire reached its height. Trajan expanded Rome to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia and bringing immense wealth. Hadrian consolidated instead, building fortifications like the famous wall in Britain. Antoninus Pius ruled peacefully, his reign marked by stability and prosperity. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, embodied the Stoic ideal, leading Rome with wisdom, even as he fought relentless wars on the frontiers. Yet his decision to pass power to his son Commodus broke the tradition of adopting capable heirs, and it would cost Rome dearly. Commodus inherited the throne in 180 AD, and with him the Golden Age ended. Unlike his father Marcus Aurelius, who had embodied wisdom and discipline, Commodus was reckless, vain, and more interested in personal glory than in governing the empire. He fancied himself a living Hercules, posing for statues in lion skins and demanding recognition as a god. He even fought in the Colosseum not as a proper gladiator, but as a showman who staged mock battles, cutting down helpless opponents while basking in applause. To the Roman elite, this was scandalous, a humiliation of the imperial dignity. Meanwhile, corruption flourished. Commodus neglected affairs of state, leaving administration to favorites and mistresses who sold offices and exploited the treasury. The empire's stability wavered. Conspiracies mounted, and after years of misrule, his enemies struck. In 192 AD, Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestler. With no clear successor, Rome plunged into civil war once more. The following year, known as the Year of the Five Emperors, saw chaos. Pertinax, a respected senator, was chosen, but ruled only 3 months before being murdered by the Praetorian Guard. The throne was then auctioned off, literally sold to the highest bidder, Didius Julianus, whose reign lasted just 9 weeks. Outraged generals in the provinces raised their armies, and 3 contenders marched on Rome. Out of this scramble emerged Septimius Severus, a hardened commander from Africa who seized control and founded the Severan dynasty. Severus was ruthless and militarily minded. He strengthened the army above all, raising pay and privileges while sidelining the Senate. Enrich the soldiers and scorn all others, he reportedly advised his sons. His rule marked a turning point. Rome was no longer a state. Balanced between civil and military power, the army was supreme. After his death in 211 AD, his son Caracalla inherited the throne, infamous for both cruelty and a radical reform. In 212 AD, he extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire. On the surface, it was a gesture of inclusivity. In practice, it expanded the tax base. Caracalla's reign ended in assassination, as had so many before. The Severan line collapsed into instability, and by the mid-3rd century, Rome entered its deepest crisis yet. From 235 to 284 AD, the empire endured what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Over 50 emperors rose and fell in just 5 decades, most killed in battle or by their own troops. Civil wars erupted endlessly as generals vied for the purple. Simultaneously, barbarian invasions pressed from the frontiers. Persia re-emerged as a formidable eastern power, and the economy fractured under the weight of debased coinage and endless war. At one point, the empire even split apart. A Gallic empire formed in the west, and a Palmyrene empire under Queen Zenobia broke away in the east. For a time, Rome itself seemed on the verge of disintegration. Yet through all this chaos, remarkable figures emerged. Emperor Aurelian, ruling briefly from 270 to 275, reconquered the breakaway states, fortified Rome's walls, and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. But he too fell to assassination. The crisis revealed both Rome's fragility and its resilience. The empire nearly collapsed under internal and external pressure, yet it endured. Finally, stability returned under Diocletian, who seized power in 284. Realizing the empire was too vast for one man to rule, he divided authority among 4 emperors in what became known as the Tetrarchy. Each ruled a region, sharing responsibility for defense and administration. It was a bold attempt to solve the problems that had plagued Rome for a century. Diocletian also restructured the economy, reformed taxation, and imposed strict controls. He pursued unity through religion as well, famously launching the Great Persecution against Christians in an effort to revive traditional gods. Though brutal, these reforms bought the empire another century of life. The Republic was long gone. Even the early Principate of Augustus was a memory. Rome had become an overt military monarchy, transformed by crisis into something harder, less flexible, but still Roman. After Diocletian's reforms, the empire survived, but the changes were permanent. The old illusion of the Republic, carefully preserved by Augustus, had faded. Power now rested openly in the emperor's hands, supported by the army and an increasingly complex bureaucracy. The Tetrarchy divided responsibilities. 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 juniors called Caesars, intended to provide stability and smooth succession. For a while, it worked. The frontiers were defended, revolts crushed, and order restored. But no system could erase ambition. When Diocletian retired voluntarily in 305 AD, the balance collapsed. Rivalries erupted as emperors and their heirs fought for dominance. Out of this turbulence rose Constantine, one of Rome's most pivotal figures. After years of civil war, he defeated his rivals, most famously at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. According to tradition, on the eve of battle, he saw a vision of the Christian cross with the words, "In this sign you will conquer." He ordered his men to fight under that symbol and triumphed. Whether the story is literal or propaganda, it marked a turning point. The Christian God had entered Rome's politics of power. Constantine consolidated control and reunited the empire under his sole rule, but his most lasting act was the founding of a new capital. On the site of Byzantium, he built Constantinople, a city of immense walls, palaces, and forums strategically placed between Europe and Asia. In 330 AD, it became the new Rome. Though the old city on the Tiber remained important, Constantinople was better positioned for trade, defense, and administration. It would outlast the western half of the empire by 1,000 years. Constantine also reshaped religion. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, now enjoyed imperial favor. The Edict of Milan in 313 granted freedom of worship across the empire. He patronized churches, convened councils to settle doctrine, and tied the church to the state. The faith spread rapidly, gaining prestige and power as emperors aligned with bishops and clergy. What began as a small movement of outsiders became woven into the fabric of Roman identity. By the end of the century under Theodosius, Christianity would be the official religion of the empire. This religious shift transformed Rome as profoundly as any conquest. The gods of Jupiter and Mars still adorned old temples, but the cultural tide had turned. Cathedrals rose, pagan rituals waned, and the empire itself began to see its destiny through a Christian lens. The once diverse spiritual life of Rome narrowed into a single faith, one that claimed universality just as Rome itself had once done. Politically, however, the empire's challenges deepened. Constantine's dynasty could not provide lasting stability. After his death in 337, his sons divided the empire again and fought among themselves. Civil wars weakened defenses, while external pressures mounted. Germanic tribes pushed harder at the Rhine and Danube. Persia under the Sassanids threatened the east. The empire was stretched thin. By the late 4th century, the situation became dire. In 376, waves of Goths fled into Roman territory, driven by the advance of the Huns. At first, they were allowed to settle, but mistreatment and corruption turned them hostile. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Emperor Valens led his army against them. The result was catastrophic. The Roman legions were annihilated, Valens himself killed. It was one of the worst defeats since Cannae, and it showed the empire could no longer dominate its enemies as before. Rome struggled to adapt. The military increasingly relied on barbarian recruits. Sometimes entire tribes settled as allies within the empire. These federates fought for Rome, but their loyalty was never absolute. The lines between Roman and barbarian blurred, and the old idea of a unified citizen army was gone. By now, the empire was less a single cohesive state than a patchwork of regions held together by tradition, bureaucracy, and the emperor's will. Still, even in decline, Rome endured. Its cities remained centers of culture, its roads tied provinces together, and its laws shaped society. The empire that had seemed eternal was faltering yet not finished. But the fall of the West was approaching, and soon the city of Rome itself would face storms it could not withstand. The 4th and 5th centuries brought a storm that Rome could not contain. Pressure on the frontiers mounted as tribes displaced by the Huns surged toward Roman lands. The empire tried to manage these migrations by absorbing groups as allies, granting them land in exchange for military service. But each wave strained the system further, and discipline within the empire itself weakened. Civil wars among Roman claimants left borders unguarded, while the treasury struggled to support armies spread too thin. In 410 AD, disaster struck. The Visigoths, once federates within the empire, turned against their Roman hosts. Led by Alaric, They marched on Italy, besieged the capital, and for 3 days Rome was sacked. It was the first time in nearly 8 centuries that the Eternal City had fallen to foreign hands. Though much of the city survived, the psychological blow was immense. To Romans who believed their empire divinely ordained, the sack felt like the end of the world. But Rome staggered on. The Western emperors, weak and often puppets of powerful generals, shifted their court to Ravenna, a more defensible city. In the east, Constantinople remained strong, richer, and better fortified. Increasingly, the empire looked less like a unified whole and more like 2 distinct states, one that would endure and one that was dying. The Vandals followed, sweeping from Spain into North Africa. By 439, they captured Carthage, cutting off Rome's vital grain supply. From there, they dominated the western Mediterranean, even launching a naval raid that sacked Rome again in 455. Unlike the Visigoths, they stripped the city of treasures, enslaved its people, and carried off its wealth by ship. The humiliation was complete. Rome, once the master of the seas, had been plundered by a power it could no longer challenge. Meanwhile, other tribes carved territories out of the empire. Franks settled in Gaul, Saxons in Britain, Visigoths in Spain, Vandals in Africa. What had once been Roman provinces became kingdoms in their own right. The Western emperors clung to the title but ruled little beyond Italy. And even there, their authority was contested by powerful generals of barbarian descent who commanded Rome's remaining troops. The final blow came in 476. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustus, ironically named after the city's founder, was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer. He did not bother installing another puppet emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern emperor as sole ruler. The Western Roman Empire was no more. Yet the fall was not a single moment, but a long unraveling. Even after 476, Roman law, culture, and identity persisted in the successor kingdoms. The Goths and Franks, styled themselves heirs of Rome and the Church, carried Roman traditions into the medieval world. The empire in the east, what we call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 more years, preserving much of Roman administration, culture, and learning. For those who lived through it, though, the collapse of the West was earth-shattering. The great city that had ruled the Mediterranean, whose legions had marched from Britain to Mesopotamia, had withered into memory. The vision of Rome as an eternal state had been broken. What remained was its legacy, echoing in law, language, architecture, and faith across continents. Rome had not ended in fire alone, but in transformation. It ceased to be a political state in the West, but as an idea, it never died. And in the East, it still lived on, powerful and proud, though in a changed form that would face its own trials. The fall of the Western Empire left Constantinople as the heart of Rome. The Eastern Empire, later called Byzantium, preserved the imperial system even as its western half collapsed. Protected by massive walls, enriched by trade routes linking Europe and Asia, and sustained by fertile lands in Anatolia and Egypt, it stood as a fortress of Roman civilization. Its emperors called themselves Romans, its citizens called themselves Romans, and to much of the world it remained Rome. In many ways, the East was better equipped to survive. The capital at Constantinople was strategically placed on the Bosporus, controlling access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The city's walls, begun under Constantine and reinforced under Theodosius II, were nearly impregnable. Its harbours bustled with merchants carrying silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, and treasures from across the Mediterranean. Wealth flowed in sustaining armies and palaces alike. Culturally, the empire evolved. Greek replaced Latin as the dominant language, especially in government and literature. Christianity, now the state religion, shaped every aspect of public and private life. The church became a central institution, wielding influence alongside the emperor. Icons, rituals, and theology gave the Byzantine world a distinct identity, yet they still saw themselves as heirs of Augustus and Constantine, guardians of the Roman name. The reign of Justinian in the 6th century epitomized this ambition. Determined to restore the empire to its former glory, he launched campaigns to reconquer the lost western provinces. His brilliant general Belisarius defeated the Vandals in North Africa and waged long wars in Italy, briefly retaking Rome itself. For a moment, it seemed the dream of a reunited empire might come true, but the cost was staggering. The treasury-emptied cities were devastated, and new threats loomed on the frontiers. Justinian's reign was also marked by transformation at home. He ordered the codification of Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, a monumental work that preserved centuries of legal tradition and influenced systems of law across Europe for centuries to come. He rebuilt Constantinople after a massive riot, destroyed much of the city, commissioning the magnificent Hagia Sophia, a church of soaring domes and glittering mosaics that still stands today. His legacy was both grandeur and overreach, Rome reborn, but at immense cost. After Justinian, the empire faced relentless pressure. Plagues ravaged the population, earthquakes and famines struck, and waves of enemies pressed in Persians from the east, Slavs and Avars from the north, and soon Arab armies carrying the new banner of Islam. By the 7th century, the empire lost Egypt, Syria, and much of the Middle East, its wealthiest provinces, to the swift expansion of Islamic caliphates. The dream of restoring the old empire faded for good. Still, Byzantium endured. It adapted, shrinking but surviving. Its armies reorganized under the theme system, where provinces supplied both soldiers and resources for defense. Its culture became a fusion of Roman governance, Greek language, and Christian faith. Constantinople remained a jewel of the world, dazzling visitors with its palaces, churches, and bustling markets. The Roman idea lived on, but in a new form, less an empire of conquest, more a state of resilience. For centuries to come, Byzantium would guard the legacy of Rome, standing as a bridge between antiquity and the medieval world, between East and West. The Byzantine Empire, though battered, entered a long age of survival. By the 8th and 9th centuries, it had transformed into a leaner, more defensive state. No longer the sprawling empire of Augustus or Trajan Byzantium, was instead a fortress civilization, guarding its heartland around Constantinople, Anatolia, and the Balkans. Yet within those borders, it developed a culture of remarkable resilience and creativity. One of the great challenges of this era was the rise of Islam. Arab armies, energized by faith and conquest, struck deep into Byzantine lands, capturing Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. The empire fought desperately to hold Anatolia, often clashing on its eastern frontier in brutal campaigns. Constantinople itself was besieged twice in 674 and again in 717. Both times, the city survived thanks to its massive walls' naval skill and the mysterious weapon known as Greek fire, a flaming substance that clung to ships and burned even on water. The survival of Constantinople preserved Europe from immediate Muslim conquest and gave Byzantium centuries more life. Internally, Byzantium wrestled with religious conflict. The great controversy of iconoclasm, whether icons and images of Christ and the saints should be venerated or destroyed, split the empire for more than a century. Emperors and clergy fought bitterly over doctrine, and mosaics were smashed or restored depending on who held power. The struggle revealed how deeply religion shaped Byzantine identity. Faith was not just personal, but political, capable of sparking riots and wars. Despite these upheavals, The empire experienced a revival under the Macedonian dynasty, beginning in the 9th century. This was a golden age of Byzantine culture. Scholarship flourished, classical texts were preserved, and art reached dazzling heights in mosaics, manuscripts, and architecture. Missionaries from Byzantium carried Christianity north, converting the Slavs and laying the foundation for Orthodox traditions in Russia and Eastern Europe. The empire's influence stretched far beyond its shrinking borders, shaping the spiritual map of the continent. Militarily, Byzantium regained ground. Generals pushed back against Arab forces, reclaiming parts of Asia Minor and the Balkans. Under Basil II, nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer, the empire crushed Bulgarian resistance and reasserted dominance in the Balkans. By the early 11th century, Byzantium once again stood as a great power, wealthier and more secure than it had been in centuries. Yet, its strength was deceptive. The empire relied heavily on fragile alliances, mercenary armies, and a delicate balance of internal factions. Beneath the surface, rival aristocratic families vied for control, weakening imperial authority. At the same time, new threats emerged on the horizon. Normans in the west, Turks in the east, enemies who would test Byzantium's defenses in ways it had not faced before. Even so, Byzantium remained Rome in the eyes of its people. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans guardians of the legacy, stretching back to the Senate and people of Rome. Their emperors still wore the purple. Their law still traced back to Justinian. Their faith still defined by the councils of emperors past. The Western Empire had fallen to ruins. But in the East, the idea of Rome endured with remarkable tenacity. By the 11th century, Byzantium's fortunes began to turn once more. Though Basil II had secured the Balkans and restored the empire's prestige, his successors lacked his strength. Internal rivalries and complacency eroded the foundations he had built. The vast treasury he left behind was squandered, and the disciplined armies he commanded grew soft. As the ruling families of Constantinople feuded for influence, new enemies gathered strength at the borders. In the east, the Seljuk Turks emerged as a formidable power. Fierce warriors of the steppe, they embraced Islam and pressed into Anatolia along the empire's military heartland. In 1071, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes faced them at the Battle of Manzikert. What should have been a defensive stand turned into catastrophe. Betrayed by rival factions and abandoned by parts of his army, Romanos was captured, and the empire's hold on Anatolia shattered. The loss opened the door for Turkish settlement, transforming the region that had sustained Byzantium for centuries. Meanwhile, in the west, another danger appeared. The Normans, descendants of Viking settlers in northern France, conquered southern Italy and Sicily, stripping Byzantium of its last holdings there. Powerful at sea and ambitious on land, they became another thorn in the empire's side. The Byzantines, once rulers of the Mediterranean, now struggled to defend even their core territories. Desperate, the emperors turned to the west for help. In 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos appealed to the Pope for aid against the Turks. The call sparked something far greater than he intended the First Crusade. Tens of thousands of warriors from across Europe marched east, not just to defend Byzantium, but to reclaim Jerusalem. The Crusaders passed through Constantinople with uneasy cooperation, suspicious of their Byzantine hosts. Together they achieved stunning victories, capturing Antioch and Jerusalem. But instead of restoring lands to the empire, they carved out their own Crusader states. Byzantium had gained allies, but also rivals planted deep in its former territories. Still, the Komnenian dynasty stabilized the empire for a time. Under Alexios John II and Manuel I, Byzantium regained strength, reclaiming parts of Anatolia and maintaining influence across the eastern Mediterranean. Trade with Venice and Genoa enriched the capital, filling Constantinople with goods from every corner of the known world. The city dazzled visitors with its churches, palaces, and markets, still the greatest metropolis of Europe. Yet the relationship with the West remained uneasy. Religious disputes between the Latin Church in Rome and the Orthodox Church in Constantinople deepened, culminating in the Great Schism of 1054. Mutual excommunications severed the unity of Christendom, and mistrust festered. The Byzantines viewed Westerners as crude and greedy. Westerners saw Byzantines as arrogant and untrustworthy. This tension would prove disastrous. The breaking point came with the Fourth Crusade. Originally intended to strike at Egypt, the crusade was diverted to Constantinople in 1204, driven by Venetian ambition and Byzantine intrigue. The Crusaders stormed the city, sacking it with unprecedented brutality. Churches were looted, relics, stolen treasures melted down. For 3 days, Constantinople suffered a devastation it had never known. The empire fractured with Latin rulers installed in the capital, and Byzantine successors clinging to survival in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. Though the Byzantines eventually retook Constantinople in 1261, the empire was but a shadow of its former self. Its wealth was gone, its population reduced, and its territories carved away. The city remained magnificent, but the empire's days of power were behind it. Now survival was the only goal, and even that seemed uncertain. The restored Byzantine Empire, after 1261, bore little resemblance to the powerhouse of old. Michael VIII Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople from the Latins, but the victory came at a cost. The city he reclaimed was a ruin of its former self, its walls damaged, its treasures looted, its population scattered. Rebuilding required resources Byzantium no longer had. The empire's territories were fragmented, its economy drained, and its military weakened. Though the Palaiologan dynasty held the throne, their rule was more about survival than dominance. Trade shifted further into the hands of Venice and Genoa Italian maritime powers who controlled the sea lanes and drained wealth from Constantinople. The empire's dependence on these merchants only deepened its vulnerability. Politically internal strife persisted. Civil wars between rival claimants to the throne consumed precious energy, leaving Byzantium unable to confront the greater threats rising around it. The most formidable of these threats was the Ottoman Turks. Emerging in Anatolia as one of many Turkish principalities, they proved exceptionally disciplined and ambitious. By the 14th century, they had crossed into Europe, establishing a foothold in the Balkans. Step by step, they pressed closer to Constantinople, while Byzantium, racked by poverty and infighting, could do little to stop them. The empire became a patchwork, its territory reduced to the capital, a few holdings in Greece, and scattered islands. Diplomacy became its main weapon. Emperors sought aid from the West, offering church union in exchange for military support. But union was bitterly opposed by much of the Byzantine clergy and people who viewed Latin Christianity with suspicion. These divisions left the empire isolated, caught between enemies abroad and distrust at home. In 1453, the final act arrived. Sultan Mehmed II, determined to claim the city, laid siege to Constantinople with one of the largest armies ever assembled by the Ottomans. He brought massive cannons that battered the Theodosian walls' defences that had withstood centuries of assaults. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI and his outnumbered defenders held valiantly, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Appeals for Western aid brought only a trickle of soldiers and ships, not nearly enough. For nearly 2 months, the siege raged. Then, on the 29th of May, 1453, the Ottomans broke through. The city fell, its churches converted, its treasures seized. Constantine XI is said to have cast off his imperial regalia and died fighting on the walls. With his death, the last Roman emperor was gone, and the Byzantine Empire ended. After more than 1,000 years, the eastern half of Rome had finally fallen. Yet in another sense, Rome did not die. Its legacy lived on in the Ottoman state, which inherited its lands and even its claim to universal empire. It lived on in Russia, whose rulers styled themselves Tsars, heirs of the Byzantine emperors. It lived on in the Renaissance, as scholars fleeing Constantinople carried ancient texts to Italy, sparking a rebirth of learning. Rome had ceased to exist as a political state, but as an idea of law, empire, civilization, it remained immortal. From Romulus to Constantine XI, from the Tiber to the Bosporus, Rome had endured for more than 2 millennia. No other state in history matched its longevity, its influence, or its transformation. It was not eternal in body, but in spirit Rome never truly fell. Rome's fall, both west and east, left behind not ruins alone, but a foundation on which much of the modern world was built. Its influence persisted in ways both obvious and subtle. Law, language, religion, architecture, and political ideals all bore the Roman imprint, spreading across continents long after the last emperor had died. Roman law codified under Justinian became a cornerstone of European legal systems. Concepts such as contracts, property rights, and citizenship survived the empire itself, transmitted through the corpus juris civilis. Medieval kingdoms and later modern states adapted and reshaped these principles, but the skeleton of Roman jurisprudence remained. To this day, echoes of Roman law guide courts from Europe to Latin America. Language carried Rome's voice even further. Latin, once the tongue of senators and soldiers, evolved into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Even where Latin did not directly survive, it left deep marks. English, though Germanic in origin, absorbed thousands of Latin words. The language of Rome became the vocabulary of scholarship, science, and the church for centuries, binding together cultures across Europe. Religion was Rome's most profound legacy. Christianity, born in the empire's margins and once brutally suppressed, became its official faith under Constantine and Theodosius. From there, it spread across Europe and beyond, shaping civilizations for centuries. The Roman Church in the West, led by the papacy, claimed authority as the heir of St. Peter. In the East, Orthodoxy preserved Byzantine traditions of faith and worship. Both traced their roots back to Rome, even as they diverged. Architecture and engineering testified to Rome's genius. Roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and bridges dotted the lands. Once under Roman rule, many still in use 1,000 years later. The arch, dome, and vault inspired builders through the medieval and Renaissance ages. From cathedrals to capitals, the outlines of Rome's designs were reborn in new forms. Perhaps Rome's most enduring contribution was the very idea of empire, the dream of uniting diverse peoples under one authority, of blending cultures into a common identity, lived on. The Holy Roman Empire in the West, the Ottomans in the East, the Russian Tsars, and even the architects of modern Europe all claimed in some way to inherit Rome's mantle. The concept of Rome became larger than the city or its emperors. It became shorthand for civilization itself. But Rome's legacy was not only glory. It also offered cautionary lessons: the dangers of inequality, the fragility of institutions, the corrupting lure of power, and the violence of civil conflict. The Republic's fall warned of factionalism unchecked. The empire's decline showed the risks of overextension and complacency. To later generations, Rome was both a model and a warning. Even as new powers rose, the memory of Rome endured. Renaissance scholars revived classical texts. Enlightenment thinkers studied Roman politics, and revolutionaries invoked Roman virtues. The United States, in drafting its constitution, drew heavily on Roman ideals of republicanism and checks on power while adopting Roman symbols. The eagle, the Senate, even Latin mottos. Rome had fallen, but it continued to rule imagination and identity. For 2 millennia, from its mythic founding by Romulus to its twilight under Constantine XI, Rome had been many things: a city, a republic, an empire, a faith, an idea. It was brutal and brilliant, oppressive and inspiring. It conquered and assimilated, destroyed and preserved. No single judgment can capture it. Rome was not eternal in flesh, but eternal in influence. The wolf and the eagle, the Senate and the legions, the cross and the crown, all were Rome, and in some form all still are. Rome's story is also one of transformation through continuity. Across centuries of upheaval, Romans never saw themselves as starting anew. They believed they were carrying forward traditions, even when those traditions were reshaped beyond recognition. From monarchy to republic, from republic to empire, from paganism to Christianity, each change was framed not as a rupture, but as a restoration. To be Roman was to belong to something that transcended individual lifetimes. At its core, Roman identity was remarkably inclusive. Unlike the Greeks, who guarded citizenship jealously, Rome expanded it steadily. At first, only the people of the city shared in Roman rights. Then Italians, after long struggle, were admitted. Later provincials in Gaul, Spain, and the East gained citizenship. By Caracalla's edict in 212 AD, nearly every free inhabitant of the empire was legally Roman. What had once been the privilege of a small city on the Tiber became a universal status, binding together peoples of countless languages and cultures. This inclusivity was not altruistic. It served Rome's needs for taxes and soldiers, but it created a shared identity that outlasted the state itself. The Roman ability to absorb and adapt extended far beyond citizenship. In art, religion, and governance, they borrowed freely. They took Greek gods and gave them Latin names. They adopted engineering from the Etruscans' philosophy, from the Stoics' military tactics from their enemies. Rome's genius was never pure invention, but synthesis, weaving together the best of what they encountered into something larger. To be Roman was not to reject the foreign, but to transform it into part of Rome. This capacity for integration explains how the empire held together for so long. A villager in Gaul or Syria could see themselves reflected in Rome not as conquered subjects, but as participants in a vast shared project. The institutions of the state, the law, the army, the roads, bound them into a system that, while often harsh, also offered opportunity, protection, and a sense of belonging to something greater. But integration had its limits. Slavery remained the backbone of Roman society, shaping its economy and culture in ways that left deep scars. Wealth concentrated in the hands of elites, and inequality fueled unrest. Civil wars from the days of the Gracchi to the fall of the Republic revealed the dangers of imbalance between rich and poor, between Senate and people, between generals and state. Rome endured these crises, but they never vanished. Instead, they returned in new forms, testing the resilience of the system until it finally cracked. Even so, Rome's endurance is extraordinary. Few states survive a century. Rome lasted for over 2 millennia in one form or another. Its longevity was not just the result of military might, but of cultural cohesion. Roman law, citizenship, and identity proved flexible enough to evolve with circumstances. They allowed the empire to weather disasters that would have destroyed lesser powers. The sack of the city by Gauls, Hannibal's invasion, civil wars, plagues, and invasions all were survived because Rome was more than its armies or rulers. It was an idea its people refused to abandon. That idea survived the fall of empires, carried forward by the church, by successor states, and by memory. When Charlemagne was crowned in 800 AD, He was declared Emperor of the Romans, even though the city itself was long diminished. When the Ottomans took Constantinople, they too claimed Rome's inheritance. And when modern states forged republics and constitutions, they reached back to Roman examples for guidance. Rome's continuity was broken in body, but unbroken in spirit. In this sense, Rome never truly ended. It transformed, fragmented, and reappeared in new guises, but the thread remained uncut. To speak of Rome is to speak of civilization itself, its power to create, to destroy, to endure, and to inspire. Rome's legacy was not confined to politics or conquest. It shaped daily life in ways that still echo today. Consider the infrastructure of empire. Roman roads, straight and durable, connected cities across continents. Built for legions, they also carried merchants, pilgrims, and ideas. All roads lead to Rome was not just a saying, but a lived reality. Aqueducts delivered clean water over vast distances, supplying baths, fountains, and households. Even sewers like the Cloaca Maxima remain among the oldest functioning public works in the world. Rome engineered not only domination but habitability, creating urban life on a scale the world had never seen. Cities became the empire's backbone. From Londinium to Alexandria, Roman urban planning spread a grid of streets, forums, theatres, amphitheatres, and temples. The same patterns repeated across provinces, making even distant frontiers feel connected to the capital. Public spaces embodied Rome's values: grandeur, order, spectacle. To walk into a forum was to enter Rome itself, whether in Gaul, North Africa, or the Levant. The culture of spectacle defined Roman society. The Colosseum, with seats for tens of thousands, hosted gladiatorial combat animal hunts and staged naval battles. These shows entertained but also reinforced power, reminding citizens of the emperor's generosity and the empire's reach. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew crowds larger than any modern stadium. To the people, these spectacles were more than diversions. They were part of the rhythm of civic life, binding rich and poor in shared experience. Education and language further unified the empire. Latin served as the administrative tongue in the West, while Greek dominated the East. Together they formed a bilingual world of learning and governance. Roman schools taught rhetoric, philosophy, and law, shaping generations of citizens to think in Roman terms. Even as the empire fractured, Latin remained the language of scholarship and faith, carrying Roman thought into the Middle Ages. Religion, too, reveals Rome's adaptability. At first, the empire tolerated a wide array of cults and practices. Conquered gods were absorbed into the Roman pantheon, ensuring conquered peoples felt included. But the rise of Christianity changed everything. Once persecuted, it became the empire's defining faith, reshaping values, morality, and identity. Pagan temples gave way to churches, emperors became patrons of bishops, and the cross replaced the eagle as the empire's highest symbol. Through Christianity, Rome influenced not only politics, but the deepest layers of culture and belief. Art and literature carried Rome's ideals far beyond its borders. Writers like Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero became staples of Western education for centuries. Roman sculpture and architecture blended realism with grandeur, celebrating both individual achievement and collective power. Even when the empire's political authority crumbled, its cultural authority endured. The Renaissance, 1,000 years later, was built on the rediscovery of Roman models. Economically, Rome created one of the first truly interconnected markets. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, and silks from the East flowed through a network of trade routes secured by legions and governed by Roman law. A coin minted in one province circulated across the empire, binding regions together in commerce. This unity of market and currency was unprecedented and would not be matched until modern times. These threads, roads, cities, law, language, religion, culture, economy, formed the fabric of Roman life. They show why Rome's influence survived long after its political fall. The empire built not just armies and palaces, but systems that shaped how people lived, thought, and believed. And though emperors rose and fell, those systems endured, outlasting the men who claimed to rule the world. Rome's true power was not in conquest alone, but in connection, in its ability to tie together millions of lives under a shared identity. That was the foundation that kept the idea of Rome alive, even when the empire itself was gone. Roman society was layered and complex, balancing tradition with constant change. At its core stood the family governed by the pater familias, the male head who held legal authority over children, property, and even life and death within the household. This authority reflected the broader values of discipline and hierarchy that shaped Roman identity. Yet within this framework, Roman women played influential roles. While excluded from political office, they managed estates, arranged marriages, and in many cases exercised considerable social and economic power. Figures like Livia, wife of Augustus, or Agrippina, mother of Nero, demonstrate how women could wield influence behind the scenes of empire. Slavery formed another pillar of Roman life. Enslaved people labored in households, farms, and mines, their toil fueling the empire's economy. Educated slaves served as tutors or administrators, sometimes rising to positions of trust. Manumission, the granting of freedom, was common, and freedmen could rise in wealth and status, though rarely in political power. This system created mobility, but also entrenched inequality, binding Roman prosperity to the exploitation of millions. Class divisions structured public life. Patricians, the old aristocratic families, once held exclusive power, but over time, plebeians gained legal equality and access to office. The equestrian order, wealthy but non-senatorial, emerged as a vital middle elite, supplying administrators, financiers, and officers. Ordinary citizens, though lacking wealth, participated in assemblies and the army, grounding Rome's institutions in popular involvement. This social structure, though hierarchical, allowed for mobility and integration, reflecting Rome's adaptability. Religion was woven into daily existence. From household shrines to grand temples, Romans lived surrounded by ritual. The state religion reinforced civic duty, with priests drawn from political elites and ceremonies tied to public life. Festivals, sacrifices, and omens marked the calendar, binding community and state together. Yet, Roman spirituality was pragmatic. New gods were adopted if they seemed useful, and foreign cults found places within the city. This openness helped Rome absorb the beliefs of conquered peoples, making religion both a unifying force and a reflection of empire's diversity. The army, however, remained the backbone of Rome. More than a fighting force, it was a tool of integration. Veterans settled in colonies across the provinces, spreading Roman culture and securing frontiers. Service offered poor men pay honor and the chance at land or citizenship. The discipline and organization of the legions embodied Roman ideals of order and resilience. Their triumphs built empire, their loyalty sustained it. Yet over time, the same armies that expanded Rome would turn inward, supporting generals over the state and hastening the Republic's fall. Education reflected Rome's values of rhetoric, law, and history. Boys of elite families studied Latin and Greek literature, trained in oratory to prepare for public life. Schools emphasized discipline and memory, instilling respect for tradition and authority. For the broader population, practical knowledge in trade, farming, and craftsmanship shaped daily survival. Literacy spread unevenly, but inscriptions, graffiti, and documents reveal a society where words carried power from imperial decrees to marketplace deals. Entertainment bridged class divides. Theatres, amphitheatres, baths and circuses offered spaces where rich and poor gathered. Public baths in particular were hubs of Roman life, where hygiene, exercise, and socializing mixed. Chariot races, gladiator games, and festivals were not just diversions. They reinforced communal identity and reminded citizens of the empire's grandeur. Bread and circuses, as critics observed, sustained loyalty even when politics faltered. All these elements, family, class, religion, army, education, entertainment, wove together the fabric of Roman life. They show a civilization that valued order, adaptability, and spectacle, one that found strength in hierarchy, yet offered avenues for integration. Rome's power lay not only in conquest, but in creating a society where millions across cultures and continents could call themselves Roman. Rome's economy was vast, diverse, and intricately connected. At its peak, it stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, binding together regions of incredible variety. Grain from Egypt fed the cities. Olive oil from Spain filled amphorae. Shipped across the Mediterranean, wine from Gaul and Italy flowed in endless trade, and silks from the east made their way along caravans and sea routes. Roman markets buzzed with goods from every corner of the known world, and coins bearing the emperor's image circulated as a unifying symbol of economic power. Agriculture lay at the heart of this system. The majority of Romans, even in later centuries, were tied to the land. Estates, or latifundia, dominated the countryside, worked by slaves and tenant farmers. These estates produced not only food for local consumption, but surplus for trade sustaining armies and cities alike. Smallholders still existed, but they increasingly struggled against the wealth of large landowners, a tension that fueled social conflicts from the Republic into the empire. Cities were engines of consumption rather than production, sustained by this agricultural surplus. Rome itself, a metropolis of over 1 million people at its height, required an enormous flow of resources. Grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa arrived in fleets, stored in massive granaries, and distributed to citizens as part of the grain dole. This system, both practical and political, kept the capital fed and stable. Without it, the city could not survive. Trade routes tied the empire together. The Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea, was the empire's highway crossed by merchant ships, carrying goods, troops, and ideas. Overland Roman roads allowed swift movement across provinces, ensuring supplies could reach markets and armies. Provinces specialized Gaul produced wine. Britain mined tin. Egypt exported grain. Syria traded in luxury goods. The result was an integrated economy where prosperity in one region supported stability across the whole. Currency further unified this system. Roman coins minted in gold, silver, and bronze spread across the empire, carrying not only economic value but political messages. Portraits of emperors reinforced authority, while inscriptions celebrated victories and virtues. Inflation and debasement caused crises, especially in the 3rd century. But the very idea of a shared currency on such a scale was revolutionary for its time. Labor, however, depended heavily on slavery. Enslaved people worked in fields, mines, households, and workshops, forming the backbone of production. Their presence permeated every level of society. Yet manumission was common, and freedmen played significant roles in trade crafts and administration. This fluidity distinguished Rome from other slave societies, though it never erased the harsh realities of bondage. The economy was also shaped by the army. Legions required constant supplies of food, weapons, clothing, and pay. Military demand stimulated industries from farming to metallurgy. Veterans settled in colonies brought Roman culture to new regions while anchoring local economies. In times of crisis, however, the cost of maintaining armies strained the treasury, forcing emperors to raise taxes or debase currency, fueling unrest. Despite vulnerabilities, Rome's economy achieved a remarkable level of integration. Goods, people, and money moved with unprecedented speed and reliability. This interconnectedness helped sustain the empire for centuries, creating a web of dependence that bound provinces together. Even after political authority fractured the economic habits, Rome endured in medieval trade networks. What emerges is a picture of Rome not only as a military empire, but as an economic one, an empire of grain and oil, coins and roads, markets and ships. Its power was built on more than conquest. It rested on the steady flow of resources that fed its people, paid its soldiers, and filled its coffers. Without this economic engine, Rome could never have lasted as long as it did. Rome's political system, whether republic or empire, was always a balancing act between ideals and reality. The republic celebrated liberty, civic duty, and shared governance, but behind those slogans stood aristocratic dominance. Senators controlled wealth, prestige, and most offices. Yet the people had a voice through assemblies, tribunes, and public opinion, and it was this tension, elite control, tempered by popular power, that defined republican politics. Elections were central to the system. Citizens gathered in assemblies to vote for magistrates, from consuls and praetors down to quaestors and aediles. These offices carried not only duties, but prestige, forming steps on the cursus honorum, the ladder of public service. Campaigning was intense, filled with speeches, favors, and displays of generosity. Politics was personal, built on networks of patronage rather than parties. Success depended on family name, wealth, and charisma as much as on talent. The Senate, though technically advisory, was the true center of power. Composed of former magistrates, it guided foreign policy, managed finances, and advised magistrates. Its authority rested less on law than on tradition, the weight of centuries of precedent. Senators prided themselves on being guardians of the republic, but their grip often led to paralysis when confronted with new challenges. Reformers, who sought to expand power to the people, met fierce resistance, fueling cycles of conflict. Tribunes of the plebs embodied this struggle. Armed with the power of veto and sacrosanctity of office, they defended common citizens against senatorial abuse. Some used this role conservatively protecting order, while others, like the Gracchi, pushed bold reforms, sparking crises. The tribunate revealed both the flexibility and fragility of Roman politics, capable of empowering the people, but also of destabilizing the state. When the Republic collapsed into civil war, it was because these institutions proved unable to contain ambition. Generals with loyal armies, Marius Sulla Pompey Caesar, bypassed Republican limits. Violence entered politics, and the old balance shattered. The Senate could no longer check commanders with legions at their backs, nor could assemblies resist manipulation. The very strengths of the system, its traditions, its reliance on personal honor, became weaknesses when ruthlessness prevailed. The empire preserved republican forms while hollowing them out. Emperors styled themselves as restorers of tradition, claiming to serve the Senate and people. Offices continued, elections were held, and the Senate still met. But real power lay with the emperor, who commanded the armies, controlled finances, and held tribunician and proconsular powers indefinitely. Augustus perfected this disguise, calling himself princeps first citizen, while ruling as monarch in all but name. Later emperors varied in style. Some, like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, worked with the Senate cultivating harmony. Others, like Caligula and Domitian, treated senators with contempt, ruling autocratically. The Senate endured, but as a shadow of itself, stripped of real power, yet still carrying symbolic weight. Its survival gave the empire a sense of continuity, even as governance shifted to imperial bureaucracy and military command. This blend of tradition and autocracy gave Rome stability, but also new fragility. Succession was never clearly defined. Emperors adopted heirs, elevated generals, or relied on bloodlines, but disputes often led to assassinations or civil wars. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect emperors, became kingmakers, deposing rulers and selling the throne. The absence of a stable system for transfer of power haunted Rome for centuries. Yet for all its flaws, Rome's political heritage proved enduring. The idea of checks and balances, of mixed government blending monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy fascinated later thinkers. Polybius praised Rome's system as uniquely stable, and his writings influenced Renaissance scholars and Enlightenment philosophers. The American founders, in drafting their constitution, looked to the Roman model of shared powers and civic virtue, even as they sought to avoid its pitfalls. Rome's politics were turbulent, often bloody, but they set precedents that shaped political thought long after the empire itself had vanished. In the struggles of senate and people, consuls and emperors, tribunes and generals, we glimpse not only the fate of Rome, but the origins of ideas still alive today. Rome's military machine was the engine of its empire. From the earliest legions of the Republic to the professional armies of the empire, discipline and organization made Roman soldiers feared across the known world. The legion was more than a fighting force. It was a symbol of Roman identity, embodying order, loyalty, and adaptability. The structure of the legion evolved over time. In the Republic, citizens served as soldiers organized by wealth and property. The wealthy formed cavalry and heavy infantry, while poorer citizens filled lighter roles. With the Marian reforms of the late 2nd century BC, the army became professional. Recruitment opened to the landless poor, and the state supplied arms and pay. Soldiers enlisted for long terms, often 20 years, and their loyalty shifted from the Republic to their generals. This change solved manpower shortages, but planted the seeds of civil war as legions became instruments of personal ambition. A legion was a marvel of organization. Typically numbering around 5,000 men, it was divided into cohorts, centuries, and maniples, each with its own officers. This flexible structure allowed legions to maneuver and adapt to varied terrain and enemies. Training was relentless. Soldiers drilled daily building camps, marching long distances and practicing formations. Roman discipline was legendary. Cowardice or disobedience could be punished by death, while valor brought rewards and promotion. Engineering set Roman armies apart. Soldiers were builders as much as fighters. They constructed roads, bridges, and fortifications with astonishing speed. Siege warfare was a Roman specialty, with machines like ballistae, battering rams, and towers, enabling them to crack even the strongest walls. The army's ability to build and besiege expanded Rome's reach, far beyond what brute force alone could achieve. The legions also spread Roman culture. Veterans settled in colonies across conquered lands, bringing Latin language, customs, and law. These colonies anchored Roman control and integrated provinces into the empire. Roads built for military movement became arteries of trade and communication, binding the empire together. The presence of legions guaranteed not just security, but Romanization itself. Rome's enemies tested them constantly, from the disciplined phalanxes of Greece to the cavalry of Parthia, from Hannibal's tactics to Germanic ambushes. Rome faced every style of warfare. The legions learned, adapted, and often absorbed elements from their foes. They suffered defeats at Cannae, Carrhae, Teutoburg, but each loss spurred reform. Rome's resilience lay in its capacity to recover, rebuild, and return stronger. The bond between soldiers and generals was crucial. Commanders like Caesar, Scipio, and Trajan inspired loyalty through victories and shared hardships. A general's reputation could make or break campaigns, and soldiers often followed them even against the Senate. This devotion was both Rome's strength and its weakness. It built empires abroad but fueled civil wars at home. As centuries passed, the army changed again. By the empire's later years, recruitment relied heavily on provincials and even barbarian federates. These soldiers fought bravely, but their loyalties were not always secure. The old citizen-soldier ideal faded, replaced by a military increasingly detached from civilian life. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the army was less a Roman institution than a multi-ethnic force under Roman banners. It could defend, but it could not preserve unity as it once had. Still, the Roman military legacy endured. Its strategies, engineering, and discipline influenced armies for centuries. The very idea of a professional standing army owes much to Rome. Even in its decline, the legion remained a symbol of order and power, a reminder that Rome's greatness was built not only on politics or culture, but on the steel and sweat of its soldiers. Rome's cultural achievements were as enduring as its conquests. Literature, art, and philosophy flourished in ways that gave the empire a voice long after its fall. Writers like Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Livy defined not only Roman identity, but Western thought for centuries. Their works became staples of education, copied and studied through the Middle Ages, and Renaissance shaping ideas of law, rhetoric, and human nature. Cicero perfected Latin prose, his speeches and philosophical works blending Greek influence with Roman practicality. He elevated the art of rhetoric, teaching generations how to persuade, argue, and govern with words. Virgil, through the Aeneid, crafted Rome's national epic, linking its destiny to the hero Aeneas and divine will. His verses celebrated duty, sacrifice, and empire, offering Augustus a poetic foundation for his rule. Horace, with sharp wit and lyrical mastery, captured the pleasures and ironies of Roman life, while Ovid brought playfulness and sensuality in works like the Metamorphoses, whose myths echo even today. History, too, was central to Roman culture. Livy chronicled Rome's rise, with patriotic zeal blending legend and fact to inspire civic pride. Tacitus, in contrast, wrote with biting realism, exposing corruption, tyranny, and the decay of virtue under empire. Together, their works reveal Rome's self-image, sometimes idealized, sometimes brutally honest, always conscious of destiny. Philosophy thrived in Rome, though it was largely adopted from Greece. Stoicism, with its emphasis on duty, discipline, and rational order, resonated deeply. Thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus taught the value of endurance and virtue in turbulent times. Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself left Meditations a timeless reflection on the responsibilities of power and the fragility of life. These ideas shaped Roman leaders and continued to influence thinkers long after Rome's fall. Art and architecture embodied Roman values of grandeur and permanence. Borrowing from Greece, but expanding on scale, Romans built structures that awed with both beauty and function. Arches, domes, and concrete allowed feats like the Pantheon, whose vast dome still inspires architects today. Amphitheaters, forums, and aqueducts combined utility with majesty, making public life itself a spectacle of Roman achievement. Mosaics, frescoes, and statues adorned homes and cities, celebrating gods, emperors, and everyday scenes alike. Religion intertwined with culture. Festivals filled the calendar with rituals honoring gods and ancestors, blending politics and piety. With the rise of Christianity, culture shifted but did not vanish. Churches inherited Roman architectural forms, while Christian thinkers like Augustus fused Roman philosophy with theology, laying foundations for medieval thought. Education preserved and spread this cultural wealth. Roman schools drilled students in grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy, shaping elites who could participate in public life. Libraries collected knowledge, while scribes ensured texts survived. This commitment to learning meant that when Rome fell, its cultural treasures were not entirely lost. They were carried forward by monks, scholars, and translators, seeding the intellectual revival of later ages. Rome's cultural achievements mattered because they outlasted empire. Armies and emperors faded, but literature, philosophy, law, and architecture endured, crossing centuries and shaping civilizations. To study Rome is not only to recount battles and rulers, but to engage with the words, ideas, and creations that still speak to us. The Romans built not only with stone and steel, but with stories and ideas, giving them a legacy that truly was eternal. Rome's story closes not with a single end, but with transformation. What began as a small settlement on the Tiber grew into the mightiest empire the world had yet seen. For centuries, it expanded, adapted, and endured, shaping lands and peoples far beyond its borders. Its fall was gradual, stretched across centuries. Yet, even in collapse, Rome left seeds that sprouted into new civilizations. The Western Empire disintegrated under the weight of invasions, civil wars, and economic strain, but its memory persisted in the kingdoms that replaced it. Germanic rulers adopted Roman law titles and customs, presenting themselves not as destroyers, but as heirs. The Eastern Empire carried the name forward for 1,000 more years, preserving Roman governance, culture, and faith. Even when Constantinople fell in 1453, its legacy flowed into the Ottomans, into Russia, and into Europe's rebirth. Rome's endurance lay not only in its armies or emperors, but in its ideas. Law, citizenship, infrastructure, and identity bound its vast domains together. Its openness, absorbing gods, customs, and people from every land, gave it resilience unmatched in history. At times, this inclusivity brought conflict, at times exploitation, but it created a shared sense of belonging that allowed Rome to outlive its rulers. The lessons of Rome are many. It teaches the danger of inequality, the fragility of political balance, the corrosive power of civil war. It shows how institutions once eroded cannot easily be restored. Yet it also reveals the strength of integration, the power of culture, and the ability of human societies to adapt and endure. Rome was ruthless, but it was also creative, destructive, yet deeply generative. For 2,000 years, people have looked back to Rome to admire, to condemn, to imitate, to surpass. Medieval kings dreamed of its authority, Renaissance thinkers revived its art, revolutionaries invoked its republic, and modern nations borrowed its laws. Rome has become a mirror in which every age sees itself, for better or worse. Its ruins remind us of impermanence, its achievements of possibility, and its history of complexity. The story that began with Romulus and Remus, nurtured by wolves and ambition, did not vanish with the fall of emperors. It echoes still in the languages we speak, the cities we live in, the laws we follow, and the ideals we pursue. Rome never was eternal, but its influence remains so. To study Rome is to study ourselves, for we still walk roads it built, read words it wrote, and wrestle with questions it first asked. And so the curtain falls on Rome not as an end, but as a beginning written across centuries. The wolf, the eagle, the cross, all remain symbols of a civilization that changed the world. Rome is gone, yet Rome endures. Its story is history's greatest paradox, a fallen empire that never truly fell.